The purpose of this lab was to analyze the motion of a mass swinging and oscillating on a spring that started from rest and stretched. Looking at the video of the mass moving in a complicated motion, we were able to track its position throughout its movement. A computational model was created to mock the observed motion. With this model, we were able to find the forces acting on the mass with Newton's second law, as well as analyze the energy changes taking place using the energy principle. As a result, the model did a decent job of predicting the observed motion and allowed a very nice approximation of the energy changes within the system. In order to arrive at the results obtained from the model, we first had to use Tracker to observe the mass's motion. What we will eventually get from the position data is the information needed to initialize our computational model. In Tracker, the position at each frame in the video was accounted for. With these positions, a graph of position in the x direction versus time and a graph of the position in the y direction versus time could be obtained. From these two graphs, we were able to calculate the periods of oscillation, which is the time it takes for the motion to repeat itself. In this experiment, we used the average period from the y position plot, since this measures the oscillation from the spring. The oscillation in the x-plot is from the back and forth or pendulum-like motion of the mass. With the period, the spring constant is able to be calculated from this relationship, yielding the value 6.875 seconds. The spring constant is needed to create the computational model predicting the observed motion. One more thing we need to calculate for the model is the relaxed length of the spring. In this lab, it makes things easy to set the system as the entire universe, then to measure the changes happening inside the system. To calculate the relaxed length of the spring, we use what we know about Newton's second law. At the relaxed length of the spring, the system is at static equilibrium, which means that the net force is zero. The two known forces contributing to the net force are the force of the spring and the weight force. So at static equilibrium, and therefore at the relaxed length, the weight force equals the spring force. The weight force is calculated by multiplying the mass of the object by Earth's gravitational constant, and the spring force is calculated using the spring constant multiplied by s being the magnitude of the length of the spring minus the relaxed length of the spring. Setting these two equal to each other and rearranging to solve for L naught, we obtain the value 0.123 meters. From Tracker, we are also able to establish the initial position vector of the mass from the data. We must enter our calculated and our known values into the Python code as initializations. Known values include the object's mass, the fact that the initial velocity was 0, the time of observation started at 0, delta t is small compared to the duration of the motion, and Earth's gravitational constant. Once the calculated and known values are entered, we use Newton's second law to predict the motion of the mass. The forces taking place are specified and add up to the net force. Knowing the net force allows us to calculate the velocities at each time step, as well as the positions. We then have to update the spring so that the motion continues. We observe this motion, which is a mass moving on a spring in 2 dimensions, with the net force indicated by the yellow arrow. We compare this motion to that of our observed motion by importing the data points from the Tracker video. Comparing these two models, we obtain this motion. As you can see, the model does a very good job of keeping up with the observed motion with little discrepancy, so we can use this code as a good model for the video. Using Python, we update the code so that we can observe the energy changes taking place in the system, utilizing the energy principle. The energy principle states that the total change in energy equals the change in kinetic energy plus the change in potential energy. Since we choose the universe as our system, there is no energy transfers happening between the surroundings and the system. Therefore, the total change in energy is 0. There are 2 potential energy changes taking place in our system, the gravitational potential energy and the spring potential energy. This information is entered into our code as shown. In Python, iterates the calculation of the kinetic and potential energies at each time step in the object's motion. We obtain a graph like this, displaying delta K in blue, delta U spring in red, delta U gravity in green, and delta E total in yellow. As we'd expect, the total energy changes 0, indicated by the flat line, and the potential and kinetic energies oscillate as the object moves up, down, back, and forth. Looking at the model, the energies that Python creates make sense because the potential energies depend on the position of the object. The spring potential will be positive as the object moves further from the relaxed length. The gravity potential will be positive as it moves further from the Earth. The change in kinetic energy will be positive as it gets closer to the relaxed length because it is speeding up. Since the plot makes mathematical and logical sense, we conclude that the energy principle is satisfied. We can also conclude that at each time step, the gravity potential, the spring potential, and the kinetic energy changes will add together to equal 0, or the total energy change in the system. Thus far, we have used the period of oscillation from the y position data to predict the object's motion. But what would happen if we use the x position data, the data indicating the object's left and right motion? Using the same procedure to find the period and recalculating the spring constant in L naught, we obtain this motion in Python. This model does a poor job of predicting the object's motion. This is the case because our motion is largely dependent on the spring. Not accounting for the spring's period of oscillation will greatly skew the resultant motion, as evident in this alternate model. In conclusion, we were able to predict and match the motion of the object moving in 2 dimensions on a spring. By making use of Newton's second law and the energy principle iterated at each time step, the forces and the energy changes were able to be observed. We took a complicated motion and tracked it, wrote a code to predict that motion, compared the motion of our observation and our model, and drew conclusions about the energy changes taking place within the system. We found that the change in kinetic energy oscillates proportional to the object's speed, and the potentials oscillate proportional to the object's position. And with no energy transfers between the system and the surroundings, the total change in energy is zero. Thank you.